The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private club on the 82nd floor of One World Trade Center. Maxwell Bennett swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the city lights. At 42, he had built Bennett Enterprises from the ground up, transforming it into one of the most successful venture capital firms in New York. Maxwell had everything money could buy: penthouses in 3 countries, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as the man who never lost. "Quite the view, isn't it?" The familiar voice of James Calloway, his former friend and now rival, interrupted his thoughts. "Though I imagine it gets boring after a while. Nothing surprises you anymore, does it, Max?" Maxwell didn't bother turning around. Their friendship had dissolved 3 years ago when James had launched his own investment firm, poaching several of Maxwell's key clients in the process. "What do you want, James?" Maxwell's voice was as cold as the ice in his drink. James slid into the leather chair across from him, placing his own drink on the mahogany table between them. "I've been thinking about our last conversation, about how you said everything in life is just a transaction." "It is," Maxwell replied flatly. "Everyone has a price, it's just a matter of figuring out what it is." James leaned forward, a glint in his eye that Maxwell recognized from their days as college roommates at Harvard. It was the look that had preceded countless reckless escapades and ill-advised bets. "Care to test that theory?" James asked, his voice lowered despite the privacy of their alcove. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "A wager," James said, sliding a small black notebook across the table. $50 million in seed funding for that tech startup. You've been eyeing." Maxwell kept his expression neutral, though his interest was piqued. Quantum Nexus was a promising AI company that had rejected his initial offer, holding out for better terms. With $50 million, he could secure a controlling interest. "And what would I have to do for this generous offer?" Maxwell asked, not touching the notebook. James smiled, a predatory curve of his lips. "Get married." Maxwell almost laughed. "That's it? You know I've been married twice before." "Not to just anyone," James clarified. "To someone completely outside your usual sphere. Someone who contradicts everything about your carefully curated image." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "Be specific." "You've always dated the same type. Tall, blonde, from prominent families, with connections you can leverage. Women who understand, can accept that you view relationships as business arrangements," James said, counting off on his fingers. "I want you to marry someone who's your complete opposite, perhaps a plus-sized black woman from a working-class background with no interest in your wealth or status. Someone who believes in things money can't buy." Maxwell stared at him, looking for the catch. "For how long?" "6 months," James replied. "If you can stay married for that long, the $50 million is yours. If you fail, you publicly admit defeat." The great Maxwell Bennett finally bested at his own game. "And if I refuse? Then I guess I was right about you all along," James shrugged. "You can control your companies, your properties, even your exes with ironclad prenups. But you can't control someone who doesn't care about what you have to offer." Maxwell's jaw tightened. He hated being challenged, hated even more the implication that there was something he couldn't do. He'd built his empire on never backing down. "Fine," he said, finally taking the notebook. "Draw up the terms, but I want everything in writing." James's smile widened. "Of course, after all, it's just another transaction, right?" 2 weeks later, Maxwell sat in his office overlooking Central Park, reviewing the profiles his executive assistant had compiled. After signing the wager agreement with James, he'd tasked Victoria with finding potential candidates who met the criteria. As usual, she'd been thorough. "These are the 5 women who best fit the parameters, Mr. Bennett," Victoria explained, her posture perfect as she stood beside his desk. "Each has been extensively researched, though none know about this project." Maxwell flipped through the files, dismissing the first 3 immediately. Too young, too eager to please, too likely to be seduced by the lifestyle he could offer. The 4th was promising until he saw her family connections. A father who worked in venture capital would understand the game too well. Then he came to the 5th profile, and something made him pause. "Zora Washington," he read aloud. 35, director of a community center in Harlem, focused on refugee resettlement and integration. Born in Chicago to a Kenyan mother and African-American father, educated at Howard University, turned down 3 job offers from major nonprofits to continue her work in underserved communities. He studied her photograph, a woman with deep brown skin, full features, and eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera. Unlike the polished headshots of the other candidates, hers was casual, taken while she was working, surrounded by children of various ethnicities. "She seems perfect," Victoria remarked. "No interest in wealth, completely dedicated to her cause, and stubborn as hell judging by her work history," Maxwell finished. "She's rejected partnerships with 3 major corporations because she disagreed with their ethics policies." Victoria nodded. She also lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Harlem, despite qualifying for grants that could significantly increase her income. Everything she makes above basic living expenses goes back into the community center. Maxwell closed the file. Decision made. Arrange a meeting. Zora Washington wiped her hands on her jeans as she finished hanging the new educational posters in the main classroom of the Harmony Center. The building was quiet for once, the children and their families gone for the day. These evening hours were her favorite, time to catch up on grant applications and prepare for the next day's programs. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant, Damien. "Just got a call from someone named Victoria Chen. Says she's from Bennett Enterprises and wants to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow." "Sounds important." Zora frowned. Bennett Enterprises, the venture capital firm known for aggressive acquisitions and cutthroat business tactics. What could they possibly want with a small community center in Harlem? "Did she say what it's about?" Zora texted back. "Just that Mr. Bennett has a proposal that could benefit the center. Apparently it's substantial enough that he wants to discuss it personally." Zora sighed. She'd dealt with corporate philanthropy before, companies looking for tax write-offs or PR opportunities with minimal actual commitment to the communities they claimed to serve. Still, the center desperately needed funding for the new educational program she'd been developing. "Fine. Tell her I can meet at 2 p.m., but here at the center, not at their offices." If Maxwell Bennett wanted to talk, he could come to Harlem and see firsthand what they did. She wouldn't be intimidated by another wealthy businessman thinking he could buy good publicity with a token donation. Little did she know that the meeting would be about something far more personal than a corporate sponsorship, a proposition that would challenge everything she believed about herself and the rigid boundaries she'd built between her world and the realm of the wealthy elite she'd spent her life avoiding. The Harmony Center was housed in a renovated brownstone, its faded brick exterior contrasting with the vibrant mural of interconnected hands that spanned the front wall. Maxwell Bennett stepped out of his chauffeur-driven Tesla, adjusting his tailored Tom Ford suit. This neighborhood was a world away from the gleaming skyscrapers of Midtown, where he conducted business. "I'll wait here, sir," his driver said, clearly uncomfortable with the location. "Fine," Maxwell replied, glancing at his watch. 2 o'clock exactly. Maxwell Bennett was never late. Inside, the center buzzed with activity despite the afternoon hour. Children of various ages and backgrounds worked on homework at communal tables, while volunteers moved between groups, offering guidance. The walls were covered with artwork, quotes about community in multiple languages, and photographs of smiling families. A young man with dreadlocks approached him. "Can I help you?" "Maxwell Bennett. I have an appointment with Ms. Washington." The young man, Damien according to his name tag, seemed unimpressed by the name that typically commanded immediate deference. "Follow me. Zora's finishing up a tutoring session." Maxwell was led through a corridor to a small classroom where Zora Washington sat with a teenage girl, reviewing what appeared to be a college application essay. In person, she was even more striking than her photograph, her dark skin glowing under the fluorescent lights, her full figure draped in a simple wrap dress with geometric patterns. She wore her hair in a crown of intricate braids, and silver earrings shaped like the African continent dangled from her ears. She looked up, her expression shifting from warmth to professional neutrality as she spotted him. "I'll be right with you, Mr." Bennett, she said, before turning back to the girl. Remember what we discussed, Ayana. Your voice matters. Don't try to write what you think they want to hear. The girl nodded, gathering her papers. Thanks, Ms. Washington. Same time Thursday. Of course, Zora smiled, the warmth returning to her face as she watched the teenager leave. Then she turned to Maxwell, gesturing to a chair opposite her desk. Please sit down. Maxwell didn't like being kept waiting, but he reminded himself of the $50 million at stake. He sat, noticing the worn edges of the desk and the stacks of grant applications beside a framed photograph of Zora with an older woman who shared her features, likely her mother. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he began, adopting the smooth tone he used for business negotiations. I understand your time is valuable. It is, she agreed, folding her hands on the desk. Your assistant mentioned a proposal that could benefit the center. Direct. And to the point. Maxwell could appreciate that at least. Yes, though it's somewhat unconventional. Zora raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Maxwell studied her, recalculating his approach. The women he typically dealt with, business associates, previous wives, casual dates, all understood the language of transaction. They appreciated directness when it came to arrangements that benefited both parties. Something told him Zora Washington operated on different principles. I've been following your work here, he lied smoothly. The impact you've had on refugee integration is impressive, especially given your limited resources. Thank you, she replied, her expression guarded, though I doubt you came all the way to Harlem to complement our programs. No, he agreed. I came to offer you complete financial security for your center, enough funding to expand your programs, renovate this building, and ensure operations for the next decade, at minimum. Zora's eyes widened momentarily before narrowing with suspicion. And what would Bennett Enterprises want in return? Because we don't accept funding with strings attached, Mr. Bennett. We've turned down partnerships with organizations that don't align with our values. I'm aware, he said, remembering the research Victoria had compiled. This wouldn't be from Bennett Enterprises. It would be personal, from me to your organization. He paused, assessing her reaction. All I ask in return is 6 months of your time. Doing what exactly? Her voice had cooled several degrees. Maxwell leaned forward, delivering the proposition he'd rehearsed. I need a wife, Ms. Washington. Temporarily, for 6 months. The silence that followed was absolute. Zora stared at him as if he'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. I beg your pardon, she finally managed. A marriage of convenience, he clarified. Completely legal but understood by both parties to be temporary. After 6 months, we divorce amicably, and you keep the funding for your center. Zora stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Get out. Maxwell remained. Seated. $3 million, Ms. Washington. That's what I'm offering. Think of what you could do with that, the programs you could fund, the facilities you could improve, the lives you could change. You're insane, she said, but she hadn't moved toward the door to throw him out. Why me? Why not hire an actress or find someone who actually wants to marry a rich man? It needs to be authentic, Maxwell said, deciding a partial truth was necessary. I need someone who is genuinely uninterested in wealth or status, someone whose integrity is above question. For what purpose? She pressed, still standing but no longer demanding his immediate departure. A business matter, he replied vaguely. The details aren't important. What matters is that it would be a strictly professional arrangement. We would live together at my penthouse, attend certain events as a couple, and maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage. After 6 months, we part ways, and your center has funding secured for the foreseeable future. Zora sank back into her chair, her expression a mixture of disbelief and calculation. Maxwell recognized the look. She was running the numbers, weighing the needs of her center against the personal cost. This is ridiculous, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Completely absurd. It's a transaction, Maxwell countered, one that benefits us both. You get security for the work you care about, and I get What I need. She studied him with unsettling intensity. And what happens during these 6 months? What would be expected of me? Nothing inappropriate, he assured her quickly. We would live as roommates, essentially. Separate bedrooms, separate lives, except for the occasions when we need to appear as a couple. I would ask that you accompany me to certain business, functions, charity events, perhaps a holiday gathering, standard activities for a spouse in my position. And after 6 months? We file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences. Everything is handled quietly and professionally. You return to your life here, $3 million richer. Zora fell silent again, her fingers drumming against the desk. Maxwell waited, knowing better than to push. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. I need time to think, she said finally. This isn't a decision I can make on the spot. Maxwell nodded, producing a business card and placing it on her desk. Take 3 days. If I don't hear from you by Friday at noon, I'll assume you're not interested, and we both forget this conversation ever happened. He stood, straightening his jacket. For what it's worth, Ms. Washington, I'm not asking you to compromise your values. I'm offering a business arrangement that could secure the future of everything you've built here. He gestured to the center around them. Sometimes pragmatism serves idealism better than principle. Zora didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the business card as if it might burst into flames. Maxwell turned to leave, pausing at the door. One more thing, he added. This arrangement would require absolute discretion. No one can know the true nature of our Beatle relationship. 3 days, she repeated, not looking up. I'll give you my answer on Friday. For 3 days, Zora barely slept. She paced her small apartment, ran extra miles on her morning jogs, and buried herself in work at the center. But Maxwell Bennett's proposition haunted her every moment. $3 million. It was an obscene amount of money, more than the center's operating budget for the next 15 years. With that kind of funding, they could expand their educational programs, hire specialized instructors for traumatized children, provide job training for parents, and finally fix the leaking roof and outdated plumbing. But at what personal cost? To marry a man she'd just met, a man whose reputation for cold calculation preceded him, felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about relationships and integrity. Marriage wasn't a business transaction to be entered into for financial gain. It was sacred, something her parents had taught her to value through their own loving 35-year union. Yet as she walked through the center on the 3rd day, watching volunteers stretch their limited resources to serve the growing needs of their community, Zora felt her resolve wavering. Was her personal discomfort more important than the dozens of families who relied on their services? Was her principled stand against Maxwell Bennett's proposition worth the continued struggle for basic resources? By Friday morning, she'd made her decision. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the business card, her heart hammering in her chest. Bennett, his voice answered on the 2nd ring. It's Zora Washington, she said, forcing confidence into her voice. I've considered your offer. And? The single word held no emotion, just expectation. Zora took a deep breath, looking around her small office at the photographs of the children they'd helped, the thank you cards from families who'd found their footing in a new country, the community award certificates that recognized impact but provided no funding. I accept, she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue, but I have conditions. There was a moment of silence then. I'm listening. The money goes directly to the center, not to me personally. I continue my work there throughout the 6 months. I won't change who I am to fit into your world. No makeovers, no etiquette lessons, no attempts to improve me. And after the 6 months, we never see each other again. Agreed, Maxwell replied without hesitation. My lawyers will draw up the contracts immediately. We'll need to move quickly. The marriage needs to take place within the next week. The reality of what she'd agreed to hit Zora like a physical blow. A week? That's impossible. I need time to... A week, he repeated firmly. I'll handle. So the arrangements. All you need to do is show up and say, I do. Before she could protest further, he added, The first installment of funding will be transferred to the center's accounts tomorrow morning. Consider it a gesture of good faith." The line went dead, leaving Zora staring at her phone in disbelief. What had she just done? And how could she possibly explain to her friends, her colleagues, her mother, that she was suddenly marrying one of New York's most notorious businessmen? She sank into her chair, a single thought echoing in her mind. 6 months. She only had to endure this arrangement for 6 months, and then the center would be secure. 6 months of her life in exchange for hundreds of transformed lives. When Xiu viewed that way, it wasn't even a sacrifice, it was a duty. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and elaborate floral arrangements of white roses and orchids. Maxwell had spared no expense, transforming the historic venue into a winter wonderland that screamed old money and refined taste. It was exactly the kind of excessive display that Zora had spent her life avoiding. She stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The wedding dress, a Vera Wang creation delivered to her apartment 2 days ago, hugged her curves before flaring into a dramatic train. The stylist Maxwell had hired, despite her objections, had arranged her braids into an elegant updo, accented with pearl pins. "You look beautiful," her mother said, approaching from behind to adjust the veil. Amara Washington had flown in from Chicago the day before, her shock at her daughter's sudden engagement barely concealed beneath her supportive exterior. "I feel like I'm in costume," Zora admitted, fidgeting with the diamond bracelet that felt impossibly heavy on her wrist. "Like I'm playing a part in someone else's story." Amara turned her daughter to face her, dark eyes studying Zora's face with the penetrating gaze that had always seen through her childhood fibs. "That's because you are," she said simply. "What I can't figure out is why." Zora had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer repeatedly during sleepless nights. "We connected quickly," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Sometimes when you know, you just know." Amara's expression remained skeptical, and it has nothing to do with the substantial donation that mysteriously appeared in the center's account last week. Zora froze. She should have known her. Mother would make the connection. Amara still served on the center's board of directors, despite moving back to Chicago after retirement. "Maxwell is generous," Zora said carefully. "He believes in the work we're doing. Maxwell Bennett has never donated to a community organization in Harlem before," Amara countered. "In fact, one of his subsidiaries tried to buy that block of brownstones last year to convert them into luxury condos." The door opened before Zora could respond, saving her from having to craft another lie. Victoria Chen, Maxwell's impeccably dressed assistant, entered with a tablet in hand. "10 minutes, Ms. Washington," she announced. "The guests are seated, and Mr. Bennett is waiting at the altar." Amara gave her daughter one last searching look. "Whatever game you're playing, Zora, I hope you know what you're doing." She squeezed Zora's hands. "Your father and I taught you to value yourself above all else. Don't forget that." As her mother left to take her seat in the ballroom, guilt washed over Zora. She'd never kept secrets from her parents, had always prided herself on her transparency and honesty. Now she was beginning her marriage, a sacred covenant in their eyes, with a foundation of lies. Another knock at the door revealed Damien, her assistant from the center, who had agreed to walk her down the aisle after she'd fabricated a story about her father being too ill to travel. Another lie to add to the growing pile. "Ready?" he asked, his expression conveying the same confusion and concern she'd been fielding from friends and colleagues all week. Nobody could understand why Zora Washington, who had turned down dates with perfectly nice men because she was too busy with the center, was suddenly marrying a billionaire businessman she'd supposedly just met. "As I'll ever be," she replied, taking his arm. The wedding march began as they reached the ballroom doors. 300 faces turned to stare as Zora made her entrance, most of them strangers, Maxwell's business associates, clients, and high society connections. She recognized a few celebrities, a senator, and at least 2 faces she'd seen on magazine covers. And at the end of the aisle stood Maxwell, impeccable in a black tuxedo, his expression impassive as he watched her approach. It was the same expression he'd worn during their meetings with the lawyers, when she'd signed prenuptial agreements and confidentiality contracts that Victoria had delivered to her apartment. Not once during the whirlwind preparations had he shown any personal interest in her, beyond ensuring she would fulfill her role in this elaborate charade. As she reached him, taking her place beside him at the altar, Maxwell offered his arm. She took it, feeling the expensive fabric of his sleeve beneath her fingers, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look acceptable," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "You're too kind," she replied, through her own fixed smile. The ceremony passed in a blur of traditional vows and practiced responses. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Maxwell's kiss was brief and clinical, a mere brushing of lips for the benefit of their audience. The guests applauded, champagne flowed, and photographers captured every moment of the celebration that followed. Throughout the reception, Zora maintained the facade of a blushing bride, smiling until her cheeks ached as Maxwell introduced her to an endless parade of important people whose names she immediately forgot. She nodded and laughed at appropriate intervals, acutely aware of the speculative glances and whispered comments that followed them. "Never thought I'd see the day Maxwell settled down again, especially with someone so unexpected," she overheard. One woman in a red designer dress say to her companion, "Must be quite the love story," the other woman replied with a smirk. "Or quite the prenup." By the time they cut the elaborate 7-tier cake, Zora's patience was wearing thin. The performative nature of the event, the barely concealed judgment in the eyes of Maxwell's peers, the knowledge that this entire spectacle was built on deception. It all pressed down on her like a physical weight. "Just a little longer," Maxwell said under his breath as they posed for yet another photograph. "The car will take us to the airport at 11. Their honeymoon, a 2-week stay at Maxwell's private villa in the Maldives, was as much part of the performance as the wedding. In reality, Zora had negotiated that she would spend the days working remotely while Maxwell conducted business from the villa's state-of-the-art office. "I need some air," she said, slipping away from his side as soon as the photographer moved on to capture other guests. She found refuge on a small balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue, the December air biting through the delicate fabric of her gown. New York bustled below, indifferent to the elaborate performance taking place inside. People hurried home to real lives, real relationships, the authenticity Zora had always valued and now compromised. "Hiding from your own wedding?" A woman's voice interrupted her solitude. Not the most auspicious beginning. Zora turned to find a striking blonde in a form-fitting blue gown, watching her with barely concealed hostility. Something in the woman's eyes, a sharp, assessing intelligence, put Zora immediately on edge. "Just taking a moment," Zora replied evenly. "It's been a whirlwind day." "I'm sure it has been," the woman said, moving closer. "I'm Olivia Caldwell." She extended a manicured hand. "Maxwell and I have history." The implication was clear. Zora took the offered hand briefly, recognizing the name from her research into Maxwell's past. Olivia Caldwell, socialite and daughter of one of Maxwell's early investors, had been photographed with him at numerous events over the years. "Zora, Washington," she replied, though she knew introductions were unnecessary. "Or Bennett, I suppose, as of today." Olivia's smile didn't reach her eyes. Such a charming story, the community organizer and the billionaire. Maxwell must be absolutely smitten to have rushed into marriage so quickly. The undercurrent of suspicion in her voice made Zora's guard rise higher. This woman wasn't just a jealous ex. She was probing for weaknesses, for inconsistencies in their narrative. "When you find the right person, why wait?" Zora countered with a confidence she didn't feel. "Why indeed?" Olivia murmured, her gaze traveling over Zora's dress, her jewelry, her figure, with the calculating assessment of someone tallying value. "Though I must admit, you're not exactly Maxwell's usual type. He typically prefers women who fit more naturally into his world." The barb was deliberate, designed to wound. 6 months ago it might have, but Zora had spent the past week enduring similar veiled insults from the wedding planner, the stylist, even Victoria. whose professional courtesy couldn't quite mask her bewilderment at Maxwell's choice of bride. "Perhaps that's exactly why he chose me," Zora replied, meeting Olivia's gaze steadily. "A refreshing change from the predictable." Olivia's perfectly sculpted features hardened momentarily before she recovered her social smile. "How progressive of him. I do hope you know what you're getting into, dear. Maxwell views everything and everyone as assets to be managed or liabilities to be controlled, even his marriages." Before Zora could respond, Maxwell appeared at the balcony entrance. "There you are," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes conveying clear impatience. "The car is waiting." Olivia's demeanor shifted instantly, warmth flooding her expression as she turned toward him. "Maxwell, darling, I was just getting to know your bride." She moved toward him, placing a familiar hand on his arm. "Congratulations again, such a surprising match." Maxwell expertly disengaged from her touch. "Thank you, Olivia. If you'll excuse us, we have a plane to catch." As they walked away, Zora felt Olivia's gaze boring into her back. One more person who suspected their marriage was something other than a love match, and perhaps the most dangerous one yet. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek building overlooking Central Park. After returning from their honeymoon, which had been exactly as Zora expected, 2 weeks of parallel lives conducted under the same roof, with minimal interaction beyond a few stage photographs for social media, Maxwell had brought her to what would be her home for the next 5.5 months. "Your rooms are on the east wing," he explained, as the elevator opened directly into a massive foyer of marble and glass. "You have a bedroom, bathroom, sitting room, and study. I've had it stocked with whatever Victoria thought you might need, but if anything's missing, just tell the housekeeper." Zora took in the minimalist decor, the impersonal perfection of the space. Everything was in shades of white, gray, and black, with occasional chrome accents, like living inside an architectural magazine spread. "And your rooms?" she asked, setting down the single suitcase she'd brought from her apartment. Maxwell had insisted on buying her an entirely new wardrobe for appearance's sake, but she'd refused to abandon her own clothes completely. "West wing," he replied, already checking messages on his phone. "We share the common areas: kitchen, dining room, main living room, and terrace. My home office is off limits unless I invite you in." "Fine," she said. "I'll need the Wi-Fi password and information about getting in and out of the building. I'll be going to the center daily." Maxwell looked up from his phone, frowning slightly. "We discussed this. Your presence here needs to be consistent, especially in the early months. The staff will talk if you're never home." "And we agreed that I continue my work," Zora countered, crossing her arms. That was non-negotiable. The muscle twitched in Maxwell's jaw, the first crack in his perfect composure she'd witnessed. "3 days a week at the center," he said finally. "The rest of the time you work from here. We have appearances to maintain, events to attend." 4 days, she pushed back, "and I choose which events I attend based on my work schedule." They stared at each other, neither willing to concede. Finally, Maxwell gave a curt nod. "Fine, 4 days. But when I tell you an event is important, you make it work." He turned away, effectively ending the discussion. "Dinner is at 7. The housekeeper prepared something, but you're welcome to eat in your rooms if you prefer." Zora watched him stride toward the west wing, his posture rigid. For someone who had orchestrated this entire arrangement, he seemed remarkably unhappy with the reality of sharing his space. She picked up her suitcase and headed in the opposite direction, following the path he'd indicated to the east wing. The hallway opened into a suite that was larger than her entire Harlem apartment, decorated in the same austere style as the rest of the penthouse. On the bed lay a small white envelope with her name written in elegant script. Inside was a credit card, a key card, and a note in the same handwriting. "For expenses. No limit. Use it for whatever you need." Zora placed the card on the nightstand, without a second glance. She unpacked her modest possessions, arranging familiar items around the impersonal space, photographs of her parents and friends from the center, books that had traveled with her since college, the colorful throw blanket her mother had made. Small rebellions against the sterile perfection of Maxwell's world. Small reminders of who she was and why she had entered this arrangement. In the distance, she heard a phone ring and Maxwell's voice answering. For the next 6 months, they would orbit each other in this luxury prison, each pursuing their own agendas, counting down the days until they could return to their real lives. 6 months, Zora reminded herself. Just 6 months of pretense and then freedom. For her and for the center she had sacrificed her principles to save. 2 months into their arrangement, Zora and Maxwell had settled into a careful choreography of avoidance and performance. Within the penthouse, they maintained a polite distance, sharing occasional meals in silence or passing in hallways with perfunctory greetings. In public, they played their roles with practiced precision, the devoted couple whose unlikely romance had captivated New York's elite. Tonight was another performance, a charity gala for children's education that Maxwell's firm sponsored annually. Zora stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the emerald green gown that Victoria had selected for the occasion. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit, designed to complement her dark skin and full figure rather than disguise it. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Maxwell in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his expression as unreadable as ever. "The car will be here in 10 minutes, he said, his eyes briefly scanning her appearance. "You look appropriate." "Your compliments never cease to overwhelm me," Zora replied dryly. After weeks of his clinical assessments, she'd stopped expecting genuine warmth. Something flickered across his face, amusement perhaps, before he controlled it. "The Harrison Foundation has invited us to their table. Jeffrey Harrison is considering a significant investment in one of my ventures. Try to be charming, witty, the adoring wife," Zora suggested, reaching for the clutch that matched her gown. "Just be yourself," Maxwell said, surprising her. "Harrison appreciates authenticity. It's refreshing in our circles." Zora raised an eyebrow. "Authenticity? Isn't this entire marriage a performance?" Maxwell's jaw tightened. "We should. Go." The drive to the Metropolitan Museum of Art passed in their usual silence. As they approached the entrance, photographers lined the red carpet, capturing the arrival of New York's wealthiest and most influential citizens. Maxwell took Zora's hand, his touch impersonal but sure, guiding her through the gauntlet of flashing cameras. "Mrs. Bennett, over here," a photographer called. "Give us a smile with your husband." Zora turned toward Maxwell, adopting the expression she'd perfected. Over the past months, a look of contented affection that revealed nothing of the contractual nature of their relationship. Maxwell's arms slid around her waist, pulling her closer than usual. For a brief moment, she felt the solid warmth of him against her side, caught the subtle scent of his cologne. Inside, the great hall had been transformed into a wonderland of floating lights and crystalline decorations. Maxwell guided her through the crowd, stopping occasionally to exchange greetings with business associates or social connections. Zora had learned to recognize the subtle pressure of his hand at her back when he wanted to move on, the slight incline of his head when introducing someone of particular importance. They reached their assigned table, where Jeffrey Harrison, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, stood to greet them. "Maxwell, and this must be the bride we've heard so much about." Maxwell's grip on her waist tightened infinitesimally. "Jeffrey, this is my wife, Zora. Zora, Jeffrey Harrison is an old friend and one of the shrewdest investors I know," Zora offered, her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Harrison." "Please call me Jeffrey," he insisted, pulling out a chair for her. "I've been eager to meet the woman who finally captured Maxwell Bennett's heart. You've been quite the mystery." "Have I?" Zora glanced at Maxwell, who had taken the seat beside her. "Absolutely." Jeffrey's wife, Eleanor, joined the conversation. "Maxwell hasn't brought the same woman to an event twice in all the years we've known him. And now marriage, you must be extraordinary." "I'm really quite ordinary," Zora replied honestly. "Just dedicated to my work." "Which is?" Eleanor asked. Before Maxwell could intercept, Zora answered, "I run a community center in Harlem focused on refugee integration and education. We provide language classes, job training, cultural orientation, whatever helps families transition to life in New York. Jeffrey leaned forward, genuine interest in his expression. Fascinating. What inspired you to take on such challenging work? For the next 20 minutes, Zora found herself engaged in a real conversation about the center, the families they served, and the systemic challenges facing refugee communities. Maxwell watched silently, his expression inscrutable as she spoke passionately about her work, occasionally touching his arm or looking to him with practiced affection when the narrative required it. "Your wife is remarkable, Maxwell," Jeffrey said as the main course was served. "Brilliant, compassionate, and beautiful. No wonder you fell for her." Maxwell's hand covered Zora's on the table, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that appeared loving but felt mechanical. "Lois, she surprised me," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of admiration. "Completely upended my priorities." "The best ones always do," Jeffrey replied with a knowing smile. "Eleanor here made me wait 3 months before she'd even agree to a second date. Said she needed to be sure I wasn't just another Wall Street drone." Eleanor laughed. "And 30 years later, I'm still evaluating the evidence." Their easy affection made something twist in Zora's chest, a sharp reminder of the authenticity her own marriage lacked. She excused herself, needing a moment away from the performance. In the elegant restroom, she leaned against the marble counter, breathing deeply. The evening stretched ahead, more smiling, more pretending, more lying to seemingly decent people like the Harrisons. The weight of the deception felt heavier tonight, pressing against her conscience. When she returned to the table, the men had stepped away, presumably to discuss business. Eleanor Harrison patted the seat beside her. "Maxwell seems different." "With you," she observed. "Lighter somehow, less guarded." Zora managed to smile. "He keeps most people at a distance." "That's putting it mildly," Eleanor chuckled. "We've known him for 15 years, and Jeffrey still says he's never sure what Maxwell's really thinking. But when he looks at you..." She shook her head, smiling. "Well, it's nice to see him genuinely happy." Before Zora could process this unexpected assessment, Maxwell returned, extending his hand to her. "They're about to begin the auction, shall we?" As they moved toward the auction area, Zora murmured, "Eleanor thinks you're genuinely happy with me. You must be a better actor than I realized." Something flickered in Maxwell's eyes. "Perhaps I'm simply relieved this arrangement is proceeding smoothly." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Bennett?" she teased, falling into their public rhythm. "An observation, Mrs. Bennett," he corrected, but his tone lacked its usual sharpness. The auction proceeded predictably, with New York's elite outbidding each other for experiences and luxury items in the name of charity. Maxwell bid aggressively on a private dinner prepared by a celebrity chef, winning it with a final bid that made Zora blink at the excessive amount. "You just spent the equivalent of the center's annual utilities budget on a single dinner," she whispered as applause surrounded them. "It's for a good cause," he replied mildly. "Besides, now we have something to look forward to next month." Next month, the casual reference to their future, even their contractual future, struck Zora oddly. They'd reached the halfway point of their arrangement, and somehow, the thought of its eventual conclusion didn't bring the relief it once would have. The evening continued with dancing, Maxwell's hand resting properly at her waist as they moved across the floor with practiced coordination. They danced at every event, their bodies learning each other's rhythms despite the emotional distance they maintained. "You're distracted tonight," Maxwell observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Just thinking," Zora replied. "About?" She considered deflecting but found herself answering honestly. "About how easily we lie to everyone. The Harrisons seem like good people. They genuinely believe we're in love." Maxwell's steps didn't falter. Most people see what they expect to see. A sudden marriage between unlikely partners must be love. What else could it be? "Doesn't it bother you? The deception?" He considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I've always viewed social interactions as performances of a sort, everyone showing carefully calculated versions of themselves. This is just a more deliberate version of what happens every day. That's a cynical view, Zora said. Is it? His eyes met hers. Tell me you've never adjusted your behavior to meet expectations, downplayed your intelligence in certain company, emphasized different aspects of your personality depending on who you're with. Zora couldn't deny it. She had learned early, as a black woman in America, to modulate herself in different spaces. Still, this felt different, a sustained deception rather than the everyday code switching that had become second nature. It's not the same thing, she insisted. Perhaps not in degree, Maxwell conceded, but not entirely different in kind. The song ended and they separated. As they returned to their table, Olivia Caldwell intercepted them, resplendent in a red gown that seemed designed to command attention. "Maxwell," she greeted, air-kissing his cheek before turning to Zora with a practiced smile. "And Zora, how lovely to see you both. How was the Maldives? Maxwell's villa there is absolute paradise, isn't it?" The implication that Olivia had personal knowledge of Maxwell's private retreat wasn't lost on Zora. "It was beautiful," she replied, neutrally. "And domestic life," Olivia pressed, her gaze sharp despite her pleasant tone. "Settled in nicely to the penthouse? Maxwell can be so particular about his space." "We're finding our rhythm," Maxwell intervened smoothly, his arm sliding around Zora's waist in a seemingly protective gesture. "If you'll excuse us, Olivia, I believe our table is calling." As they walked away, Zora felt Olivia's gaze following them. "She suspects something," she murmured. "Olivia suspects everyone of everything," Maxwell replied dismissively. "It's her default state. Ignore her." "She seems to know you well," Zora observed, unable to keep a note of curiosity from her voice. Maxwell's expression closed off. Ancient history, nothing worth discussing. The conversation died there, as most of their personal exchanges did, cut short before revealing anything meaningful. By the time they returned to the penthouse in the early hours of the morning, they had retreated to their usual distant cordiality. A week later, Zora was working late at the center when her phone buzzed with a text from Maxwell, a rare occurrence. As he usually communicated through Victoria or not at all, "Need you at the penthouse. Important dinner, 8 p.m. She frowned at the screen. Today was Thursday, one of her center days by their agreement. She had grant applications to complete and a new adult literacy program to finalize. "Can't make it. Working late tonight," she replied. His response came immediately. Not a request. Harrison and potential investors. Crucial meeting. Zora's frustrations spiked. This was exactly the kind of high-handed behavior she'd come to expect from Maxwell. Assuming his priorities automatically outranked hers, she typed a quick response. "My work is also crucial. Send my regrets." She set her phone aside, turning back to her computer. 5 minutes later, her office door opened without a knock. Maxwell stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "What are you doing here?" Zora demanded, rising from her desk. "Apparently retrieving my wife," he replied coldly. "Did you not understand the importance of tonight's dinner?" "I understood perfectly," she said, crossing her arms. "I also understood our agreement about my work schedule. Today is a center day." Maxwell stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "This dinner has been planned for weeks. Harrison is bringing investors who could fund an entire initiative focused on educational technology, exactly the kind of thing your center needs. And you're just telling me about this now?" "I told Victoria to add it to your calendar," he said, a hint of uncertainty crossing his face. "Well, she didn't," Zora replied. "And even if she had, you can't just summon me like an employee, Maxwell. I have responsibilities here." "And responsibilities as my wife," he countered. "Fake wife," she corrected sharply. Something flickered in his eyes at that, a momentary flash of, what? Hurt. Impossible. Maxwell Bennett didn't experience hurt feelings, especially not over the truth of their arrangement. "The investors believe you're my wife," he said, his voice controlled again, "and they're particularly interested in meeting you after Jeffrey's enthusiastic description of your work here. Your presence could directly benefit the center." Zora hesitated. the practical part of her brain acknowledging the potential opportunity. "You should have discussed this with me in advance." "You're right," he conceded, surprising her. "I should have, but I'm asking you now. Will you come?" It was the asking, rather than commanding, that shifted something between them. Zora sighed, glancing at her computer screen. "I need another hour to finish this grant application. Then I'll need to go home and change." "I had Victoria bring options," Maxwell said, gesturing toward the hallway where Zora now noticed his ever-efficient assistant waited with garment bags. "And the car is downstairs. We can work with an hour." Zora shook her head, both annoyed and reluctantly impressed by his presumption. "Fine, but next time actual advance notice would be appreciated." "Noted," Maxwell replied, a hint of what might have been a genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth. An hour later, changed into an elegant navy dress that Victoria had somehow known would fit perfectly, Zora sat beside Maxwell in his car as they headed back to the penthouse. The silence between them felt different, less like avoidance and more like a temporary truce. "Your center," Maxwell said abruptly, breaking the quiet. "It's impressive." Zora turned to him, surprised by the unsolicited comment. "Thank you. I saw the classroom renovations while waiting for you. The bilingual signage, the cultural references incorporated into the decor. It's thoughtful." "The environment matters," Zora explained, warming to the subject despite herself. "When children see their heritage represented in their learning spaces, it validates their identities, helps them feel like they belong in two worlds rather than being caught between them." Maxwell nodded, his expression contemplative. "I noticed a little girl teaching an older boy how to write something in Arabic. She couldn't have been more than 7. "Fatima," Zora smiled. "She's from Syria. Her brother has dyslexia, but she's incredibly patient with him. Their parents were both professors before they had to flee." "What happens to them?" Maxwell asked suddenly. "After your programs, after they learn English and gain basic skills, what then?" The genuine curiosity in his question caught Zora off guard. For 2 months, Maxwell had never shown interest in the details of her work, treating it as simply the inconvenient reason she sometimes couldn't attend functions with him. "It depends," she said carefully. "Some find jobs matching their skills, though many have to start over in entirely new fields. Some move to communities where there are stronger support networks for their particular cultural group. The lucky ones rebuild something close to the lives they left behind. Many don't." Maxwell fell silent again, his gaze directed out the window at the passing city. When he finally spoke, his voice had a quality Zora hadn't heard before, something almost vulnerable. "When I was 10, my father lost everything," he said. "Bad investments, worse partners. Suddenly we went from a mansion in Greenwich to a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. My mother left within a month, couldn't bear the reduced circumstances, as she put it." Zora remained silent, afraid that any response might cause him to retreat back behind his usual walls. "My father worked 3 jobs, Maxwell continued. "I barely saw him. When I did, he was either sleeping or drinking. I learned early that money was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that gave you control. I swore I'd never be powerless again." The raw honesty of this glimpse into his past left Zora momentarily speechless. "I didn't know," she finally said. "No one does," Maxwell replied, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "It's not a story that fits the Maxwell Bennett brand." Before Zora could respond, the car pulled up to their building. The moment of vulnerability had passed, replaced by Maxwell's familiar, efficient demeanor as he outlined the key points about the dinner guests and their interests. Yet something had shifted. As they entered the penthouse together, Zora found herself looking at Maxwell differently, seeing beneath the polished surface to the complicated person beneath. A person who had perhaps been shaped by loss and abandonment as much as ambition. For the first time since their arrangement began, she wondered what other layers of Maxwell Bennett remained to be discovered, and why the thought of uncovering them suddenly felt like more than just part of their contractual obligation. Spring had arrived in New York, bringing with it an unexpected thaw not just in the weather, but in the penthouse overlooking Central Park. Over the past month, something had slowly shifted between Zora and Maxwell. Small changes that were almost imperceptible from day to day, but striking when viewed as a whole. Maxwell had begun asking about the center, showing genuine interest in the children's progress, and offering surprisingly insightful suggestions about program development. Zora had found herself lingering at breakfast, sharing stories about her work, or asking about his latest business negotiations. Their stilted, performative interactions had gradually given way to something resembling actual companionship. Tonight marked their 5-month anniversary, a milestone that once would have simply meant one more month until freedom, but now carried a strange weight of uncertainty. Maxwell had suggested celebrating with dinner at home, and Zora had agreed with an ease that would have shocked her former self. She stood on the penthouse terrace, watching the sunset paint the park in golden hues. The spring breeze carried the scent of new growth, a freshness that seemed fitting for the tentative new understanding between them. "Beautiful view," Maxwell said, joining her with 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing in a way that once would have been meaningless, but now sent a small current through her. "It is," she agreed, accepting the glass. "Though I never thought I'd get used to living this high above the city." "And have you?" he asked, leaning against the railing beside her. "Gotten used to it?" The question seemed to carry multiple meanings. Zora sipped her wine, considering. "Parts of it," she admitted. "Though I still miss the noise of Harlem sometimes, the music from the apartment below mine, the sound of children playing in the courtyard." Maxwell nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've never lived anywhere but towers like this. I sometimes wonder what I'm missing." "Community," Zora said simply. "The sense that you're part of something larger than yourself, something messy and imperfect but real. Is that why you love the center so much, the community it creates?" "Partly," she acknowledged. "But it's more than that. It's about creating spaces where people can rebuild their sense of belonging after having it shattered, where children can feel secure again, and adults can regain their dignity." Maxwell was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "I visited the center again yesterday," he said finally. Zora turned to him in surprise. "You did? Why?" "I wanted to see the new computer lab in action," he explained. "The one the Harrison funding helped establish." A month ago, Jeffrey Harrison had indeed come through with funding specifically earmarked for technology education at the center. Maxwell had been instrumental in securing the grant, advocating for Zora's vision with an enthusiasm that had seemed genuinely personal rather than part of their arrangement. "You should have told me you were coming," Zora said, unsure whether to feel touched or intruded upon. "I wanted to observe without changing the dynamic," Maxwell admitted. "When you're there, everyone responds differently. You're the heart of the place. I wanted to see how it functions when you're not present." "And?" "It's remarkable," he said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "The infrastructure you've built works even in your absence. The staff you've trained, the systems you've implemented, they're sustainable. That's rare, Zora. Most organizations collapse without their founder's constant presence." The praise warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you," she said simply. "There was a boy there," Maxwell continued. "Khalid, I think his name was. He was helping the younger children with the new coding program." Zora smiled. "Khalid arrived last year from Sudan. He taught himself programming from library books before we even had computers at the center. Now he's applying to specialized high schools for computer science." "He asked about me," Maxwell said, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Asked if I was Miss Zora's husband, and then proceeded to show me a game he had coded. He seemed pleased to see me." "The children know you're important to me," Zora said without thinking, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. Maxwell's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Am I?" he asked quietly. "Important to you?" The question hung between them, laden with potential meanings. 5 months ago, Zora would have deflected or reminded him of the transactional nature of their relationship. Now standing in the golden light of sunset, she found herself wanting to answer honestly. "You've become significant," she admitted carefully, in ways I didn't anticipate. Maxwell set his wineglass on the terrace table, turning to face her fully. Zora, The chime of the elevator interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They both turned toward the penthouse interior, where the doors slid open to reveal a familiar blonde figure. Am I interrupting? Olivia Caldwell called out, striding into the living room as if she belonged there. The doorman let me up. I told him I was expected. Maxwell's expression hardened instantly, the openness of moments before vanishing behind his usual mask. Olivia, what are you doing here? I was in the neighborhood, she replied breezily, though her sharp gaze took in the intimate tableau on the terrace, the wine glasses, the proximity of their bodies, the sunset backdrop, and I realized we never properly celebrated your 5-month anniversary. Quite the achievement for you, Maxwell. The emphasis she placed on achievement carried an unmistakable undercurrent. Zora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. This isn't a good time, Maxwell said, his voice clipped. Whatever you came to discuss can wait. Olivia ignored him, moving closer to Zora. You must be so proud, she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. 5 whole months of marriage to Maxwell Bennett. You've outlasted both his previous wives combined. Olivia, Maxwell warned, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. Of course, they didn't have quite the same motivation. Her gaze flicked, meaningfully between them. $50 million is quite the incentive to stay married, isn't it? The world seemed to tilt beneath Zora's feet. What are you talking about? She asked, though a sickening certainty was already blooming in her chest. Oh dear, Olivia's mock concern was theatrical. Did he not tell you about the wager? About how James Calloway bet him $50 million that he couldn't stay married to, someone completely outside his usual type for 6 months? Zora looked at Maxwell, silently pleading for a denial. His face had gone pale, his jaw rigid. Zora, is it true? She cut him off, her voice barely above a whisper. Am I a bet? Maxwell's silence was confirmation enough. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. His initial approach, the specific time frame, the total lack of emotional investment at the beginning. She had known their marriage was a business arrangement, but she had believed it was about image, about some nebulous business matter he needed to resolve. Not a wager, a game between wealthy men with too much money and too little humanity. I see, Zora said, setting down her wineglass with a hand that trembled slightly. Excuse me. She moved past them both, heading for her rooms, her mind a chaotic swirl of hurt and humiliation. Behind her she heard Maxwell's voice, sharp with anger. Get out, Olivia, now! What? I thought she knew. Olivia's false innocence followed Zora down the hallway. After all, isn't your entire relationship just a transaction? Zora closed her bedroom door, leaning against it as the first tears began to fall. The worst part wasn't the bet itself. It was how thoroughly she had begun to believe there might be something real developing between them. How completely she had been fooled by his recent interest in her work, his seemingly genuine moments of vulnerability. All of it, every shared breakfast, every thoughtful question about the center, every late-night conversation on the terrace, had been part of winning the bet, creating the appearance of a genuine relationship to ensure he collected his prize at the 6-month mark. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Zora, please, Maxwell's voice came through the wood. Let me explain, she wiped her tears angrily. There's nothing to explain. I knew this was a transaction from the beginning. I just didn't realize I was a prize in a rich boy's game. It wasn't like that, he insisted. Not at the start, perhaps, but things have changed. You know they have. Do I? She challenged, opening the door to face him. How would I know what's real and what's performance anymore? You've had me confused for weeks, making me think. She cut herself off, unwilling to admit how far her feelings had strayed from their original agreement. Maxwell's eyes reflected genuine distress. Making you think what? It doesn't matter, she said, squaring her shoulders. What matters is that in 3 weeks, our contract ends. You get your 50 million, I get the funding for the center, and we never have to see each other again. Everything proceeds exactly as planned. And if that's not what I want anymore, Maxwell asked, his voice low and intent. The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? I mean that something has changed, Zora. For both of us, I think. This arrangement, this marriage, it started as something artificial, but it's become... He hesitated, searching for words that seemed to elude him. It's become meaningful to me. You've become meaningful to me. She wanted to believe him, the earnestness in his eyes, the slight tremor in his voice, signs of vulnerability she had never witnessed in the controlled, calculating Maxwell Bennett she had first met. But the revelation of the bet had shattered her trust completely. Convenient timing, she said coolly. 3 weeks before you collect $50 million. Very meaningful indeed. Hurt flashed across his face. You think, I care about the money. Zora, I could write a check for $50 million tomorrow and barely notice it missing. This isn't about the bet anymore. Then what is it about, Maxwell? Because from where I'm standing, our entire relationship is built on lies and manipulation. You literally purchased me as part of a game. It was never about purchasing you, he argued. The center funding wasn't payment. It was the only way I could think to convince you to agree to the arrangement. Because you knew I would never marry you otherwise, Zora pointed out. That's not exactly a foundation for a real relationship. Maxwell ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I know how it sounds, but somewhere along the way, something real developed between us. You can't deny that. Zora looked away, unable to hold his gaze. She couldn't deny it. That was the problem. Despite everything, despite knowing their marriage was temporary, she had begun to feel something for Maxwell that went beyond their arrangement, had begun to see the man beneath the ruthless business persona, to appreciate his intelligence, his unexpected moments of kindness, even his dry humor. I need time, she said finally. Time to think, to process this. Maxwell nodded, respecting her boundary, even as disappointment shadowed his features. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. But Zora wasn't sure she would ever be ready. The next morning, she left the penthouse before dawn, heading straight to the center where she buried herself in work, ignoring Maxwell's calls and texts. Days passed in a blur of grant applications, program planning, and deliberate avoidance of anything related to her marriage. She had told her mother the truth, the full truth, in a tear-filled phone call. Amara Washington had listened without judgment, then offered the wisdom Zora had been too angry to see. The question isn't how this marriage began, her mother had said gently. It's what it's become, and only you can answer that. A week after Olivia's revelation, Zora sat alone in her office long after the center had closed for the day. The stack of papers before her, divorce proceedings, already prepared by Maxwell's lawyer, seemed to mock her indecision. She had only to sign them, and this chapter of her life would be over. The center's funding was secure regardless of when the marriage ended. Maxwell had made that clear in a brief, formal email. She was free to walk away. Yet something held her back. The memory of Maxwell's face when he spoke of his childhood, the genuine excitement in his voice when he described a new coding program for the center's children, the warmth of his hand accidentally brushing hers across the breakfast table. The sound of the center's front door opening interrupted her thoughts. Few people had keys. It was likely Damien returning for something. Forgotten. In here, she called, not looking up from the papers. Zora. Maxwell's voice brought her head up sharply. He stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His suit jacket missing, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. How did you get in? She asked, finding her voice. Damien, he admitted. He seemed to think we needed to talk. Zora made a mental note to have a serious conversation with her assistant about boundaries. I'm busy, she said, gesturing to the papers before her. Maxwell's gaze fell on the divorce documents, his expression tightening. Is that your decision then? We're done? Isn't that what we always planned? She countered, avoiding a direct answer. 6 months, then back to our separate lives. Plans change, he said simply. People change. Do they? Zora challenged. Or do they just get better at playing roles? Maxwell stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. I deserved that, he acknowledged. But I'm not playing a role now, Zora. I haven't been for some time. He approached her desk, his movements careful, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. The bet was real, he admitted. It was childish and degrading, and I'm ashamed of it now. But what happened afterward, what developed between us, that was never part of the plan. Zora wanted to dismiss his words, to protect herself from further hurt, but the raw honesty in his eyes made that impossible. How can I believe that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How can I trust anything about us? Because you know me, Maxwell said, his voice gaining conviction. The real me, not the Maxwell Bennett who makes headlines or closes deals. You know the man who sits on the terrace at night, wondering if he's built his life on the wrong foundations. The man who visited your center secretly because he wanted to understand what gives your life meaning. The man who has, against all expectations and his own better judgment, fallen in love with his wife. The last words hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying. Zora stared at him, searching his face for any sign of manipulation or performance. She found none, only vulnerability and a kind of desperate hope. Love, she repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. In connection with Maxwell. Love, he confirmed, a rueful smile touching his lips. Believe me, it was the last thing I expected. Maxwell Bennett doesn't do love, he does acquisitions and mergers, strategic partnerships and calculated risk. But here we are. He moved around the desk, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. I don't care about the bet, Zora. I don't care about the 6-month deadline or what James Calloway thinks. I care about waking up and seeing you at breakfast. I care about hearing your thoughts on everything from refugee education to the best coffee in the city. I care about building something real with you, if you'll give me the chance. Zora felt tears burning behind her eyes. You hurt me, she whispered, making me a part of your game without my knowledge or consent. I know, he acknowledged, not defending himself. And I will spend as long as you'll let me making that up to you. But please don't sign those papers, not yet. Give us a chance to see what this could be without contracts or timeframes or bets. Just us, figuring it out together. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. What do you say, Zora Washington? Would you consider staying married to me? For real this time? The question hung between them, laden with possibility. Zora looked at their joined hands, his pale fingers entwined with her darker ones, a contrast that somehow seemed right, natural in a way she never would have imagined. 6 months ago. I don't know if I can trust this, she admitted, her voice small but honest. What if this is just another version of the game? Maxwell's eyes held hers steadily. Then test me. Set conditions, create boundaries, ask for proof, whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere, Zora, not unless you tell me to. The sincerity in his voice reached something deep within her. Over these months, she had seen Maxwell at his most guarded and increasingly at his most vulnerable. She had witnessed his evolution from a man who viewed relationships as mere transactions to someone capable of genuine connection. And, if she was being completely honest with herself, she had undergone a transformation of her own. I need time, she said finally, and complete honesty from now on. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas. Done, Maxwell agreed immediately. Anything else? Zora thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. Yes, I want you to volunteer at the center. Not as a donor or a board member, as a regular volunteer working directly with the families. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by understanding. You want me to experience your world from the inside? Exactly, she confirmed. I need to know that you value what I've built, not just as something to fund, but as something to participate in. That you see the people we serve as human beings, not statistics or charity cases. Maxwell nodded, resolution settling in his features. When do I start? For the first time in days, Zora felt the tightness in her chest ease, slightly. Tuesday, 4 o'clock. Wear something you don't mind getting paint on. A genuine smile spread across Maxwell's face. Not the practiced charm he displayed at business functions, but something warmer, more authentic. It's a date. Zora looked down at the divorce papers on her desk, then deliberately gathered them into a folder. Not signing, not yet, but setting them aside. Giving this unexpected connection a chance to prove itself real. Not a date, she corrected, a tentative smile touching her own lips. A beginning. 6 months later, Zora stood on the terrace of the penthouse, watching the autumn leaves drift across Central Park. Behind her, the sounds of conversation and laughter spilled from the open doors, friends from the center, mingling with Maxwell's business associates at their one-year anniversary celebration. "There you are," Maxwell's voice came from behind her. He approached with 2 champagne flutes, handing one to her. "Escaping your own party?" "Just taking a moment," she replied, accepting the glass. "It's still surreal sometimes, all of this." He followed her gaze across the park, understanding in his eyes. "Do you miss your apartment in Harlem?" Zora considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but we spend enough time at the center that it doesn't feel like I've abandoned my roots." She smiled at him. "Besides, the view here has grown on me." "Just the view?" Maxwell teased, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, their bodies fitting together with the easy familiarity that had developed over months of choosing each other, day after day. "The company isn't bad either," she conceded. Inside, Damien was regaling a group with the story of Maxwell's first day volunteering at the center, how the impeccably dressed businessman had ended up covered in finger paint after an art session with the preschoolers. The memory made Zora smile. Maxwell had returned the following week without complaint, and the week after that, gradually becoming a familiar presence at the center rather than just its benefactor. "James Calloway called today," Maxwell mentioned casually. "He wanted to know if we would attend the opening of his new gallery." Zora raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell him?" "That we would be delighted," Maxwell replied, watching her reaction carefully. "If you're comfortable with it." The mention of James no longer stirred the anger it once had. Somehow, over time, the bet that had brought them together had receded in importance, becoming merely the flawed beginning of a story that had taken unexpected turns. "I think I can manage to be civil," Zora said dryly, "as long as you don't mind if I mention that his $50 million has been put to excellent use funding our new technology education initiative." Maxwell laughed, the sound warm in the cool evening air. "I would expect nothing less." From inside came the sound of tinkling glass, Amara Washington calling for everyone's attention, likely preparing to make a toast. Zora's mother had been the last to accept the authenticity of their relationship, her protective instincts on high alert after learning of its deceptive origins. It had taken months of seeing Maxwell's genuine commitment to Zora and the center before she had given her tentative blessing. "We should go in," Zora said, turning toward the gathering. Maxwell caught her hand, holding her back for a moment. "Before we do," he said, suddenly serious, "I wanted to ask you something." Zora turned back to him, curious at his shift in tone. "What is it?" "Our marriage began as a contract," he said, his eyes intent on hers, "with specific terms and a defined duration. But what it's become, what we've become together, is something I never could have anticipated or quantified." He took both her hands in his. "So, I wanted to ask if you would consider a renewal of sorts. Not a legal document or a business arrangement, but a promise. Her commitment to continue building this life together, not because of any external incentive, but because of what we've found in each other." Zora felt her heart expand in her chest. This man, who had once viewed everything through the lens of transaction and control, was asking for something that couldn't be contained in contracts or measured in financial terms. "Are you proposing to your own wife, Maxwell Bennett?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips. "I suppose I am," he acknowledged with a soft laugh. "It seems fitting, given our unorthodox beginning, that we might need more than one attempt to get this right. Zora stepped closer, placing a hand against his cheek. "I think we're doing just fine," she said softly. "But yes, I accept your non-proposal proposal. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Maxwell's smile illuminated his face in a way that still took her breath away, the genuine happiness that had gradually replaced his careful mask of control. "Together," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that held nothing of their original performance and everything of the real connection they had forged. From inside, they heard Amara's voice calling them by name. Hand in hand, they turned to rejoin their guests, stepping back into the celebration of a union that had begun as the most unlikely of bets and transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. A love that defied calculation, a partnership built on understanding rather than advantage, and a future limited only by what they dared to dream together. Film da Historia. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by Zora and Maxwell's journey from a cold contract to genuine love. This transformation reminds us that sometimes life's most precious connections begin in the most unexpected ways. For more emotional stories that explore the complexities of human relationships, we've created a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring unique narratives that reveal the depth and beauty of life's most meaningful moments. We're eager to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite part of Zora and Maxwell's journey?